B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, July 13th, 2017. Couple of quick programming notes. Tomorrow on my regular Friday Facebook Live video feed, we'll be delivering the podcast. And then I have a special interview guest, Bill Binney, the former NSA technical director, who will be joining me at 2:30 Pacific Time, 5:30 Eastern, as we beam live worldwide on Facebook. And he is going to respond to the latest study by a forensic digital analyst about how those materials left the DNC server. And this new analysis supports Bill Binney's original contention that it was a leak and not a hack, an insider who accessed the information, not some remote hacking by Russia or anyone else. And we'll get into detail about that in a bit. But I want to lead the podcast today by playing for you segments of Rachel Maddow's television show from last night, from Wednesday night, July 12th, and I want to comment on some of the remarks that she made. Because as I look at this picture, and this is an evolving story, and I've been very clear with you that my skepticism remains strong, but when faced with actual evidence, like the Eric Trump document, the email that he released, and if we see some of these anonymous sources come public and say, yes, I'm the one who told you about this, then I will change my position as indicated by evidence and testimony. But to date, we remain mired in a largely fact-free narrative. The first real evidence, as I'm pointing out, is from Don Trump's email. And yet Rachel Maddow treats this as, she said, game over on Tuesday night, that this is just simply a matter of time until all of this caves in and unravels, and this leads to the removal of Donald J. Trump as the 45th president. Now, I know many of her viewers love that scenario. They just can't wait for facts to catch up with the narrative. But we must be patient, and we must stay in the real world. So here I'm going to play portions of the first 5 minutes of Rachel Maddow's television show from July the 12th and comment about what she says and what it's based on. Here we go.
But I want to start with something that came out in May. In mid-May, Time magazine published a big story about one prong of the Russian attack on the U.S. election last year. As we've been talking about, that effort really had three prongs, three different components. First, there was the straight-up hacking effort by Russia to try to penetrate local and state election systems all over the country, mostly targeting voter registration rolls. We still don't have a clear sense of why they did that, what they did with the access that they gained through that attack, what they were trying to do, whether that may have been laying the groundwork for something in the future. I'll say, just personally, I find it mildly distressing that under the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security doesn't seem overly interested in investigating what the consequences were of that hacking attack and whether U.S. election systems might be compromised in a way because of that attack that we...
Now, let's pause here and comment. First of all, she refers broadly to a Russian attack. And this is part of her larger narrative. It is based on the elements that she has pieced together over the last year, largely based on leaks and anonymous sources. But she doesn't say reported, reputed, alleged, possible, probable. None of those qualifiers are used. She treats leaked information as fact. And when she talks about the attempts to hack into registrars of voters and a software company that manages voter and election software, she is highly exaggerating because these alleged attempts occurred in late October, far too late to have any impact on the voting process or the bigger picture of manipulating the election. And from what we can tell, these were phishing attempts where somebody at an elections office got an email, and if they had clicked on it, it might have opened up to a hacker the opportunity to get into voter databases. But we are assured repeatedly by the spooks and by elected officials who've been briefed by the spies that Russia's attempts did not in any way shape the tabulation of votes or the outcome of the election process, and who was declared the winner. So there's contradiction right there. And what Rachel fails to mention, while she's focused on this unproven allegation of Russian hacking of election facilities, she just blows right past the possibility, the high probability, that these same election facilities that are so vulnerable have been hacked by Americans, including nefarious Republicans, including nefarious Democrats who, at least in a dozen states, produced outcomes. The official outcomes were at wide variance from the exit polls, suggesting that techniques were used to deny Bernie Sanders votes that he won. No, that's never mentioned. And keep in mind that Rachel's entire narrative is never challenged by somebody like me or Glenn Greenwald or Robert Perry or Bill Binney, who is skeptical of the assertions and the narrative that she is presenting. We return to Ms. Maddow.
Second prong of the attack was their attack on political institutions, specifically the Democratic National Committee, the Clinton campaign. This is where Russian hackers stole information off of American servers. And then, unlike a normal spying operation where the Russians would, keep those documents, keep those secrets for themselves so the Russian government could use that information to inform its own actions, instead, they took that information, they repackaged it, and then they fed it back to us. They fed it back to the American public in a way that was designed to do maximum damage to one presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, and to provide maximum benefit to another, Donald.
Now, her theory there is based on the assertions in the intelligence report that was released on January 6th of this year. In the passage that you just heard from Rachel Maddow, she mixes up, conflates the State Department emails that Jason Leopold led the charge to force release of that showed various issues that came into the campaign that led to criticism of Hillary Clinton. And Rachel, once again, fails to acknowledge the deep unpopularity of Hillary Clinton as a candidate, the strong opposition to many of her policies, her hawkish foreign policy, her refusal to adopt the more progressive positions of Bernie Sanders on minimum wage, on student loans, on college tuition, on health care under a single-payer plan. Those policy positions caused voters to make decisions, I believe, much more than any kind of Russian bots or fake news or this alleged hacking that Rachel believes in so fervently. And once again, no critics are permitted to enter into this narrative.
Trump. So that was the second prong. First was the attack on the election infrastructure. Second was the stealing stuff and repackaging it and sending that stuff they stole back at the American public.
And that's what Hillary has referred to as weaponizing of her emails. And keep in mind that the information that was released by WikiLeaks, and I don't know how WikiLeaks got it, I am not convinced that the Russians had anything to do with that. In any event, the information that WikiLeaks released was accurate. It was not doctored. It was not in any way manipulated. And people were able to ignore it, as many Hillary supporters did, or, look into it to help inform who they decided to vote for last November.
The third prong of their three-prong attack was what they did on social media and in media. The manipulation of news and online discussion of news and the interrupting and steering of social media traffic to, again, hurt one candidate in the presidential election, Hillary Clinton, and to help their preferred candidate, Donald Trump.
Now, as she's saying that, on the screen are quotes, screen grabs from the intelligence community assessment that was released on January 6th, and I have ripped that to shreds many times on this podcast and in interviews with intelligent people like Bob Perry and Bill Binney. And yet she clings to that document when any objective person who reads it realizes that it is evidence-free, it is filled with assertions and claims of high confidence, and it's backed up by a meaningless attack on RT, the Russian cable news channel that nobody watches in this country. And so I'm going to stop here. I think my point has been made. To date, we have one shred of evidence. And Rachel Maddow and liberal media people are going bonkers. They're going too far with it. And this may be the thread that we can pull on that will unravel the entire fabric of this scandal. But I'm not so confident. And I hope you will continue to raise questions, think critically, and be skeptical of what you hear. So, Trump brought his whole family. Well, with the exception of Malaria and Barron, and we haven't heard of Tiffany in quite a while. But, the adult kids were part of the campaign, and Eric and Don Jr. are back at the Trump Tower running the company, while Ivanka and Jared are selflessly sacrificing to perform public service. But it's Jared Kushner's failure to report his contacts with Russian persons that led to this latest wave of coverage that has so embarrassed Donald Père et Fils. And it's because Jared Kushner had to amend his filings for his security clearance, and he added more than 100 additional names of contacts that he should have reported earlier. And so bringing amateurs and arrogant people with this big sense of entitlement, because Kushner came from a wealthy family, married into a rich family, they feel like they are above the law, the rules don't apply. And here's the latest excuse from Kushner and Paul Manafort, who was the volunteer campaign manager for Trump at the time of the June 9th, 2016 meeting with the Russian attorney. And the email that brought both Kushner and Manafort to the meeting did include a statement from Rob Goldstone, who originated the emails and originated the plan for a meeting, that the Russian government wanted to help Trump win, and that this woman would be bringing information from a top prosecutor in Russia, deep dirt on Hillary Clinton. Well, through emissaries, both Kushner and Manafort are telling us, well, it was on the fourth page of a forwarded conversation. I never read it. I didn't read to the bottom of the email thread. And, that may be true. So I realize that we do have some incriminating evidence of Don Trump Jr. And I'm curious about that. Yesterday, I raised the question, why would he release this information that's incriminating to himself? I still don't have a good answer. And Daddy gave an interview it was a hard-hitting interview to Pat Robertson over at the Christian Broadcasting Network. And he offered this bizarre bullshit argument. He said that Putin would have preferred Hillary. And that's why Trump doesn't believe that Russia interfered in the election. We're the most powerful country in the world. We're getting more and more powerful because I'm a big military person. As an example, if Hillary had won, our military would be decimated. Well, that's not true. She's a hawk. That's one of the reasons many progressives abandoned her. He went on in his daydream, that's why I say, why would he want me? Because from day one I wanted a strong military. He doesn't want to see that. When I want tremendous energy, we're opening up coal, we're opening up natural gas, we're opening up fracking. Now, come on. Obama did all that stuff. That's why many of us were offended by how Mr. Change provided great continuity, particularly to offshore drilling, despite the blowout in the Gulf. I mean, he lives in such a fantasy world. He talked about his meeting with Putin last week in Hamburg. He said that he pressed him twice. I said, "Did you do it? Did you mess with our elections?" He said, "No, I did not. Absolutely not." Then I asked him a second time in a totally different way. He said, "Absolutely not." And Putin, he added, somebody did say if he did do it, you wouldn't have found out about it, which is a very interesting point. He's just all over the place. Now, I want to thank Linda Lewis, a sharp listener and whistleblower, who drew my attention to an article at The Hill. And it explains how this Russian lawyer, Natalia Veselnitskaya, got permission to come into the United States. It was a very special grant because she did not have a visa. And so the Attorney General, who was Loretta Lynch at the time, gave her a special pass to come into the country. And this is called an immigration, what is it called? It's a discretionary act that the statute allows the Attorney General to do in extraordinary circumstances. And it is referred to as immigration parole. So she was allowed in the fall of 2015 to attend court hearings in 2016 in January for a client of hers who was facing charges here in the United States, Russian businessman Denis Katsiev. So that's how she got into the country the first time. And then it appears that the courts granted her extensions or would ask the Justice Department to extend her immigration parole. Now, I can't explain everything here, but Natalia, who speaks no English, came to help represent a client in an American court. What good would she do? And why would Loretta Lynch give special dispensation to allow this Russian lawyer, who's now being tied to Putin and oligarchs, into the United States? That is a lingering question. We also learn that after she met with Trump and Manafort and Kushner, she went to Washington, where a couple of days later she appeared at a hearing on Capitol Hill related to the Magnitsky Act and Putin's response, which was to ban adoption of Russian children by Americans. She also was present at a screening of a film that we're going to talk about in a moment that was shown at the Newseum near Capitol Hill in the same time frame. And she attended a dinner with the chairman of the House Subcommittee overseeing Russia policy, Republican Dana Rohrabacher, a congressman from California, where one of my former heroes, Ron Dellums, lobbied him to change the name of the Magnitsky Act, if not repeal it entirely. So we've got questionable behavior by Ron Dellums, who is one of the staunchest critics of the Vietnam War and a real peacemonger when he was a member of Congress. He ran the Armed Services Committee in the House. And we have the linkage of the Obama Justice Department in allowing this woman into the country. So it does appear that the overarching focus of her activities was about the Magnitsky Act and not delivering dirt from the Russian prosecutor to the Trump campaign, dirt on Hillary Clinton. So as we dig into this, I want to thank my friend and colleague Robert Perry at consortiumnews.com because he published the backstory today on Natalia Veselnitskaya and the story about the Magnitsky Act. So I'm going to try to compress it here because Perry was able to see a documentary that was prepared about this. And the Magnitsky Act was championed by an American billionaire hedge fund operator who was burned in Russia. His name is William Browder. So he hired a Russian documentarian to make a film that supported his case, that Magnitsky was a whistleblower and a hero who had exposed fraud in Russia. But when the filmmaker Nekrasov did his research, he turned up contradictions in Browder's storyline. And Nekrasov discovered that a woman working in Browder's company was the actual whistleblower and that Magnitsky, rather than a crusading lawyer, was an accountant who was implicated in the scheme. Now, Magnitsky has been convicted of fraud or something like that after death in Russia. And so this becomes, more complicated. But the effort to change the name of or repeal the Magnitsky Act does seem to be, based on the information we have so far, the real intention, the real focus of Veselnitskaya in trying to score a meeting with a Trump. So there's much more to learn about this. I've linked to Bob Perry's story and the Hill story. Examine them. Ask your own questions. As I mentioned at the top, Bill Binney has agreed to join me tomorrow on our live feed on Facebook. That'll be at 5:30 Eastern, 2:30 Pacific. Bill Binney left the NSA from one of its top positions as technical director. And he has maintained, and he's one of the reasons I've stayed skeptical about all this, that the DNC breach was a leak and not a hack. He doesn't say that Seth Rich did it, and neither do I. But this recent forensic report from an unknown independent operation called the Forensicator indicates that the speed with which the files were transferred could not have been achieved by a remote hack, and therefore was more likely the product of somebody plugging a flash drive into a computer that had direct access to the DNC server. And I want to be clear, because the scrappy independent news outlet Mint Press News published a story today based on this, and I have it in my hand. It is based on the same source that I gave you 2 days ago when I raised this issue. And I am not saying that the Mint Press story is a second source. And I'm pointing this out because that's the kind of game that corporate media operators like Rachel Maddow are using. Two outlets report the same thing from anonymous sources. They may be the same anonymous sources, they may not be. But because two outlets report it, Rachel thinks, well, we can treat that as a fact. And I do not yet treat the Forensicator's work as fact. I find it interesting and newsworthy. And I'll get an expert comment on it from Bill Binney tomorrow. I hope you'll be watching on Facebook or listening on the podcast when I release it at about 3 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins podcast. And a new person named Craig Luke kicked in $100 the other day. Craig, I don't know what motivated that, but thank you very much. And I like to thank Joe Clarici, Brian Wilcuts, Brian Mazzi, and Mark Brodsky. They're all regular contributors to the Peter B. Collins podcast. I'd like you to join them. Come on over to my website, peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, and it takes you to the sign-up page where you can pick an option that's comfortable for you. The New York Times today published a timeline of the Trump Jr. interaction with Goldstone that led to the meeting with the Russian lawyer. Yes, her name is a tongue twister. And I'm linking to it so you can take a look at it. But one of the things they focus on is that within hours of Don Jr.'s receipt of the email promising dirt from the Russians on Hillary, Daddy gave a comment after clinching the presumed nomination of the Republican Party. He said, I'm going to give a major speech probably Monday of next week, and we're going to be discussing all the things that have taken place with the Clintons. Hillary Clinton turned the State Department into her private hedge fund. The Russians, the Saudis, the Chinese all gave money to Bill and Hillary and got favorable treatment in return. Now, that information was available from Hillary's State Department emails. And the linkage of it to the meeting with Veselnitskaya, I think, is highly speculative. It could be true. And it may be just flat speculation. Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell unveiled his revised health care plan to Republican senators today and got blindsided as Lindsey Graham and a senator from Louisiana named Bill Cassidy. And so we now have two competing versions of Obamacare repeal and death panel implementation from two different pockets of the Republican Party. Now, the McConnell version does have some changes that make it slightly more palatable. But the bottom line is it still hacks Medicaid in ways that will sentence Americans to death. And they're throwing more money at unexpected insurance company costs because they're planning to embrace a Ted Cruz plan to sell really shitty coverage to people who don't have much money. And that's going to throw off the risk pools that the insurance companies have. So the Republicans say, well, we'll just throw them another $70 billion on top of the $110 billion that was in the previous version of the bill. They're also stepping up more money for opioid treatment. But if you don't have insurance coverage, you're not going to be able to access that treatment. There are already a couple of senators. Rand Paul says he will vote against starting debate, and Susan Collins of Maine seems very squeamish about this. The new version does include the repeal of the employer mandate. And I've been yakking about this, and nobody else picks up on it. I think this is the most extreme element of the repeal effort that the Republicans are promoting. It would say that your employer no longer has to provide health coverage for full-time workers. And most people seem to be oblivious about that. The Graham and Cassidy bill does have some relaxation of the cap on Medicaid spending, but it's kind of vague. And they claim that they're not trying to undercut Mitch McConnell, and they are simply trying to offer an alternative for Republicans to vote on. Well, today in Paris, the trophy wife met the cougar wife, as Trump accepting an invitation from Emmanuel Macron, the new president of France, to come to Paris and hang out for Bastille Day. And the Macrons met the Trumps. And the reason I said cougar wife, in case you don't know this, is Emmanuel Macron's wife was his high school drama teacher. So she's like 18, 20 years older than him. And, of course, Trump's trophy wife is 18 or 20 years younger than he is. We'll see if this provides any relief from Trump's tweeting habit as he escapes the heat, both political and real, in Washington, D.C. Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions III, he's calling for a return to the Nancy Reagan era of the 1980s. Yes, he believes that shaming children can prevent the expansion of the opioid crisis in this country. He made the comments as he announced the largest healthcare fraud takedown in American history, claiming that 400 people, including 56 doctors, were involved in schemes that produced $1.3 billion in false and fraudulent billing. Now, I don't know the details of that, but I understand how doctors might have overprescribed OxyContin to people. I don't understand how the doctors profit from that, unless they hold stock in the company that makes it. I just don't know. At any rate, he said there are three ways to deal with the rising drug epidemic. One is prevention, which I believe will work. History showed it worked in the 80s and 90s. We need to have a reinforced message to stay away from these drugs. But when pressed, he did acknowledge that the prescription problem is different from the street drug and crack problem of the 80s and 90s. We have never seen this kind of deaths from prescription drugs, he said, mangling the English language. It is a much more deadly crisis than we had with drugs in the 1980s. Thank you for contradicting yourself within a 5-minute period. Yesterday was a big day of action. You may have logged onto a website where it said if net neutrality is enacted, if it's repealed, this website may not be available to you. Well, I think it was fairly effective, but it's not going to stop the FCC from repealing the net neutrality rules. And the big operators like Comcast and Verizon, they're hypocrites because I've seen ads from Comcast on my Facebook feed claiming that they support net neutrality. If that's the case, why did the telecom industry give $1 million to Greg Walden, the Republican from Oregon, $122,000 from Comcast alone? Republican Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee got $500,000 from telecom. John Thune, senator from South Dakota, who supports repeal of net neutrality, got nearly $500,000. And so these companies tell their customers, we support net neutrality, while they grease the elected officials who will help them ensure its repeal. I want to direct your attention to an interesting article that listener John Lefrancois forwarded to me the other day. It appeared in Jacobin Mag, and it's bylined Branko Marketic. And Branko does a great job of defining Tulsi Gabbard, the congresswoman from Hawaii, who has a rosy image because she's a surfer, she's young, and she's taken on the Democratic Party establishment. She endorsed Bernie Sanders. She is opposed to regime change wars. And in all those aspects, I respect her. But what this article uncovers is the dark side of Tulsi Gabbard. Now, I don't blame her for positions she took when she was 23, when she was against gay rights, gay marriage. She apparently inherited that from her conservative father, and she says serving in the military changed her mind. But, as the article exposes, her disturbing comments about Islam and Islamic extremism and radical Islam, those are Republican talking points. Those are Trump talking points, and they're dangerous because the Islamic State doesn't care if you call them Islamic extremists or radicals. But moderate members of Islam do. And that's the whole reason why Obama was restrained with that language and why Trump is an idiot for claiming that it's, unleashing or it's eliminating political correctness to just blurt it out. And also her ties to India's Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi are troubling. Take a look at the article. I think you'll find it interesting. Today, the government of China announced the passing of Liu Xiaobo. I don't know if I've pronounced his name correctly, Ziaobo. He was the first Nobel Peace Prize laureate to die in state custody since 1938. And he had late-stage cancer, which was unaddressed for a long time until it became public, and there were efforts to take him out of China for treatment, but he passed away today, locked away under guard in a hospital. And finally today, some of you may know that I'm a sailor, and I was out on San Francisco Bay over the weekend, and I looked over my shoulder and saw a humpback whale breaching inside San Francisco Bay. It was quite a sight. And that links to this story today from New Brunswick, Canada, where an American volunteer went to rescue a whale that had been tangled up in fishing lines or other man-made obstructions. And Joe Howlett made the trip as part of the Campobello Whale Rescue Team into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And he helped free the whale, disentangle him, and then the whale flipped and ended up killing Joe Howlett. Thanks for listening to my News and Comment podcast today. As always, it's available on YouTube if I remember those 3 mouse clicks. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to